What if the solution to one of the planet's biggest pollution problems wasn't a machine, a chemical, or a billion-dollar cleanup project? What if the answer was simply a plant? Right now, across the world, millions of acres of land are contaminated with toxic metals. These poisons come from mining, industrial factories, chemical spills, and decades of pollution that slowly seeped into the ground. In many places, the soil is so polluted that crops cannot grow. Entire landscapes are abandoned because the earth itself has become dangerous. Lead, cadmium, arsenic, mercury. These metals don't simply disappear. They stay in the soil for hundreds or even thousands of years, slowly spreading through ecosystems. Traditional cleanup methods are incredibly expensive. Often the only solution is to dig up the soil, load it onto trucks, and transport it to hazardous waste facilities. For large contaminated areas, this process can cost millions or even billions of dollars. And sometimes the pollution is simply too widespread to remove, so the land remains poisoned. But hidden within nature is a strange group of plants that seem to do something almost impossible. Instead of dying in toxic soil, they absorb the poison. These plants literally pull heavy metals out of the earth and store them inside their stems and leaves. Over time, the soil slowly becomes cleaner. Scientists call this process phytoremediation. The name sounds complex, but the meaning is simple. Phyto means plant. Remediation means repair. In other words, it's the process of using plants to repair damaged soil, and some plants are astonishingly good at it. One of the most famous examples is a species known as Brassica jonesea. At first glance, this plant looks completely ordinary. It's related to common vegetables like cabbage and broccoli. Farmers have grown it for centuries, but underground, something remarkable is happening. The roots of this plant act almost like microscopic pumps, pulling metals such as lead, chromium, and cadmium from the soil. Instead of poisoning the plant, these metals are transported into its tissues, where they are safely stored. Over time, as the plant grows larger, it removes more and more contamination from the ground. When the plant is harvested and removed, the toxins leave with it. It sounds almost like science fiction. Yet this process is very real, and scientists have been studying it for decades. But here's where the mystery begins. Now, if plants can actually clean polluted soil, why aren't they being used everywhere? Why do governments still spend enormous amounts of money on mechanical cleanup methods? And why have most people never even heard of phytoremediation? To answer that question, we need to look at where this discovery first began. The story starts in some of the most polluted places on Earth. In the late 20th century, scientists studying old mining regions noticed something strange. In these areas, the soil was filled with toxic metals, levels so high that most vegetation simply couldn't survive. The ground looked barren and lifeless, but scattered across the landscape were small patches of plants that were somehow still growing. At first, researchers assumed these plants were simply tolerant of pollution. But when scientists analyzed the leaves in laboratories, they made a shocking discovery. The plants contained extremely high concentrations of heavy metals. In some cases, the metal levels inside the plants were hundreds of times higher than normal. These plants weren't just surviving toxic soil, they were collecting the toxins. This discovery introduced scientists to a special group of plants now known as hyperaccumulators. Hyperaccumulator plants have evolved the ability to absorb enormous amounts of metals from the soil without dying. Today, researchers have identified more than 700 different plant species with this ability. Some accumulate nickel, others absorb arsenic, some specialize in zinc or cadmium. Each species has evolved its own method of interacting with the minerals in the soil. One of the most fascinating examples is a fern known as Pteris vittata. This fern has an unusual appetite for arsenic, one of the most toxic elements on Earth. In contaminated soil, the plant pulls arsenic from the ground and stores it inside its leaves. Over time, the soil becomes less toxic. Experiments have shown that repeated planting and harvesting cycles can significantly reduce arsenic contamination. In some test sites, arsenic levels dropped dramatically within just a few years, and the fern itself survived perfectly well. For scientists, it was a powerful proof of concept. Nature had already developed a system capable of cleaning polluted soil, but the deeper researchers looked into these plants, the stranger the story became. Because many of these hyperaccumulator species evolved long before humans ever created industrial pollution, which raises a fascinating question. Why would plants evolve the ability to absorb toxic metals in the first place? The answer lies deep in the evolutionary history of the Earth. Millions of years ago, certain regions of the planet naturally contained soils rich in unusual minerals. These environments were extremely hostile to most plant life, but a few species slowly adapted. Instead of avoiding the metals, they began absorbing them. Over countless generations, this ability became stronger, and eventually these plants developed a remarkable defense strategy. By storing toxic metals inside their tissues, they made themselves poisonous to animals that tried to eat them. In other words, the metals became a natural form of protection. Plants that accumulated more metals were less likely to be eaten. And over millions of years, evolution refined this survival strategy. The result was a group of plants capable of surviving in soils that would kill almost everything else, plants that could tolerate and even collect toxic metals. But scientists soon realized something even more interesting. These plants weren't just cleaning pollution, they were also collecting valuable metals: nickel, zinc, cobalt, elements that industries normally extract through mining, which led researchers to explore an unusual idea. What if plants could actually be used to mine metals from the soil? The concept became known as phytomining, and if it worked, it could transform the way we think about both pollution and natural resources. But that discovery also revealed something surprising about why phytoremediation isn't used everywhere. Because while these plants are powerful, they also have limitations. And those limitations may explain why one of nature's most remarkable cleanup systems remains largely unknown to the public. But the real reason might be even more complicated than that. Because in some cases, the obstacles to using these plants are not just scientific, they're economic. And understanding that hidden truth may reveal why the world still struggles to clean some of its most polluted landscapes. If plants can remove toxic metals from the soil, why aren't fields of these cleanup plants growing across every polluted landscape on Earth? At first glance, phytoremediation seems like the perfect solution. It's natural, relatively inexpensive, and environmentally friendly. Instead of bulldozers and chemical treatments, you simply plant seeds and let nature do the work. But when scientists began testing this idea in the real world, they discovered something important. Nature's solutions are powerful, but they are rarely fast. Hyperaccumulator plants remove pollution slowly. A single plant may absorb only a small amount of metal during its lifetime. Even when large areas are planted, the process can take many growing seasons to significantly reduce contamination. For lightly polluted soil, this might take a few years. For heavily contaminated land, it could take decades. In situations where toxins pose an immediate risk to nearby communities, governments often choose faster methods. Digging up contaminated soil, although expensive, can remove the danger almost immediately. Phytoremediation, by contrast, is more like a long-term healing process. But time isn't the only limitation. Another challenge involves the plants themselves. Many hyperaccumulator species are relatively small and slow-growing. Some grow only in specific climates or soil conditions, which makes it difficult to deploy them in every polluted location. For example, the arsenic-absorbing fern Pteris vittata works well in warm environments but struggles in colder climates. Other plants that absorb nickel or cadmium may grow only in certain regions where they evolved naturally. Scientists have tried to overcome this problem by studying the genetic traits that allow these plants to accumulate metals. Some researchers hope that these traits could one day be introduced into faster-growing crops or trees. If that happens, it could dramatically increase the power of phytoremediation. But even if scientists succeed in creating stronger hyperaccumulator plants, another question remains. What happens to the toxins once the plants absorb them? Remember, these plants store heavy metals inside their tissues. When the plants are harvested, the toxic material is still present. This means the plant matter must be carefully handled and disposed of, or processed in a way that safely removes the metals. In some cases, the plants are burned in controlled facilities. The metals remain in the ash, which can then be collected and stored safely. In other cases, researchers attempt to recover valuable metals from the plants themselves. This process is part of the emerging idea known as phytomining. One remarkable plant involved in this research is Berkheya coddi, a species native to South Africa. This plant has an extraordinary ability to accumulate nickel from the soil. In some cases, its leaves can contain over 1% nickel by weight, an incredibly high concentration for a living organism. Scientists realized that if large fields of this plant were grown on nickel-rich soil, the harvested plant material could potentially be processed to extract the metal. In other words, the plants could function as a type of biological mining system. Instead of blasting open mountains and digging massive pits, farmers could grow plants that slowly gather valuable metals from the ground. It's an idea that could transform how we think about both mining and environmental restoration. Yet, despite these fascinating possibilities, phytoremediation still remains relatively rare. And this is where the story becomes a little more complicated, because the obstacles are not only scientific or environmental, they are also economic. Cleaning polluted land is a massive global industry. Environmental remediation companies earn billions of dollars each year using technologies designed to remove or neutralize contaminants. Heavy machinery, chemical treatments, soil washing systems. These methods are expensive, but they also create large contracts and major infrastructure projects. Phytoremediation, by comparison, is inexpensive. In many cases, the cost of planting and harvesting cleanup plants is only a fraction of traditional methods. But because the process takes longer, It doesn't always fit the economic or regulatory frameworks used in environmental cleanup. But governments and companies often prefer methods that provide fast, measurable results. And sometimes the slow, quiet work of plants simply doesn't attract the same attention as large-scale engineering projects. However, this doesn't mean phytoremediation is being ignored. In fact, several countries have already begun using plants to restore polluted landscapes. In parts of Europe, hyperaccumulator plants have been used to reduce heavy metal contamination near old mining areas. In China, certain plant species are being tested to clean soil polluted by decades of industrial activity. And in the United States, researchers have experimented with planting trees to stabilize contaminated land and prevent toxins from spreading into nearby waterways. Some projects combine multiple species of plants to maximize cleanup efficiency. Deep-rooted trees may absorb pollutants from groundwater, while smaller hyperaccumulator plants remove metals from surface soil. Together, they form a layered system of natural filtration. And as research continues, scientists are discovering new species with remarkable abilities. Some plants appear capable of breaking down complex organic pollutants, including petroleum compounds and pesticides. Others form partnerships with microorganisms living in the soil, tiny bacteria that help convert toxins into less harmful forms. These underground relationships between plants and microbes may be one of the most powerful tools nature has for restoring damaged ecosystems. But even with these discoveries, the full potential of phytoremediation is still unfolding. Every year, scientists identify new plants with unusual environmental abilities. And some of these discoveries raise an intriguing possibility. What if nature has already evolved solutions to many of the environmental challenges we face today? Solutions that have been quietly developing for millions of years in forests, wetlands, and remote landscapes. Plants that not only survive harsh environments, but actively transform them. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating questions of all. If these plants can remove pollution from soil, could they also help repair some of the largest environmental disasters in human history? Because in several places around the world today, contamination has reached levels that once seemed impossible to clean. And researchers are beginning to test whether plants might succeed where traditional cleanup methods struggle. But the results of those experiments reveal something both hopeful and surprising. Because when scientists planted these remarkable species in some of the most polluted places on Earth, the plants did something no one expected. In some of the most polluted places on Earth, scientists have begun testing an idea that once seemed almost impossible. Instead of relying only on machines and chemical treatments, they started planting fields of hyperaccumulator plants, species capable of absorbing toxic metals from the soil. The goal was simple: let nature attempt what expensive technology struggled to achieve: slowly repair contaminated land. One of the most fascinating experiments involved arsenic pollution, a toxin that can contaminate soil and groundwater for generations. In certain regions, arsenic levels became so dangerous that entire areas were considered unsafe for farming. But researchers decided to try something unusual. They planted large patches of a fern called Pteris vittata, a species already known for its ability to absorb arsenic. Over the next few growing seasons, something remarkable happened. The ferns thrived. Their roots drew arsenic out of the soil and transported it into their fronds. When the plants were harvested, the contaminated plant material was safely removed. Each cycle removed a small portion of the toxin from the ground. Year after year, the soil slowly became cleaner. This wasn't an overnight miracle. The process required patience and careful monitoring. But the results proved something important. Nature already had tools capable of repairing damage that humans created. Oh, and arsenic isn't the only pollutant scientists are trying to remove with plants. In areas contaminated by heavy metals like nickel and zinc, researchers have planted species such as Berkheya coddi, which has an extraordinary ability to store nickel inside its tissues. In experimental fields, these plants gradually removed measurable amounts of nickel from the soil. Once harvested, the plants were dried and processed, leaving behind ash that contained concentrated metal. This led scientists to explore the idea of phytomining, the possibility that plants could be used not only to clean pollution, but also to recover valuable metals. Instead of blasting open mountains or digging massive pits, farmers might one day cultivate fields of metal-accumulating plants. It's a concept that sounds futuristic, but early experiments suggest it may actually be possible in certain environments. And yet, despite these promising results, phytoremediation is still far from becoming a universal solution. There are practical challenges. The process can be slow, especially in heavily contaminated areas. Some pollutants are difficult for plants to absorb. And environmental conditions, such as climate, soil chemistry, and water availability, can influence how well these plants grow. But even with these limitations, the potential remains enormous. Across the planet, there are millions of acres of degraded land, old mining sites, industrial zones, abandoned factories. where the soil has been damaged by decades of pollution. In many of these places, the land sits unused because traditional cleanup methods are too expensive. Phytoremediation offers another possibility. Instead of leaving contaminated land abandoned, scientists can plant species that slowly begin restoring the soil. Over time, the area can transform from a barren landscape into a functioning ecosystem again. Plants grow, microorganisms return to the soil, insects and animals follow, the land begins to recover. And perhaps the most surprising part of this story is how much we still have to learn. Researchers continue discovering new hyperaccumulator species in remote ecosystems. Some of these plants grow only in tiny regions, where unusual geology has shaped their evolution for millions of years. In those environments, plants have adapted to survive extreme soil conditions that would kill almost everything else. All these adaptations have created biological systems that scientists are only beginning to understand. Some plants cooperate with underground microbes that help convert toxic metals into forms the plant can absorb. Others produce special proteins that bind to metal ions and safely store them inside plant cells. These complex biological processes are the result of millions of years of evolution, a natural engineering system that quietly interacts with the chemistry of the Earth. And every time researchers uncover a new hyperaccumulator plant, it raises an intriguing possibility. What other environmental solutions might nature already be hiding? Plants that could help restore polluted rivers, plants that stabilize soil after wildfires, plants that absorb carbon dioxide more efficiently, plants that break down industrial chemicals that would otherwise remain in the environment for decades. The deeper scientists look into plant biology, the more they realize that plants are far more than passive organisms rooted in the ground. They are active participants in shaping the planet's ecosystems. Their roots interact with minerals, microbes, water, and atmospheric gases in ways that influence entire landscapes. In many ways, plants are the planet's original environmental engineers. And yet for most of human history, we have barely noticed the complexity of what they are doing beneath the soil. Which brings us back to the question that started this story. If plants can clean toxic soil, why aren't they used everywhere? The truth is that phytoremediation is not a miracle solution. It cannot instantly erase every environmental disaster, but it does offer something incredibly valuable, a natural, sustainable way to begin repairing damage that once seemed permanent. In a world where pollution has spread into nearly every ecosystem, even small improvements matter. And perhaps the most hopeful lesson from these remarkable plants is this. The Earth may already contain many of the tools needed to heal itself, tools that evolved long before humans began altering the planet on an industrial scale, solutions rooted not in complex machines, but in the quiet intelligence of living systems. Because sometimes the most powerful technology on Earth isn't something humans build. Sometimes it's something that has been growing quietly for millions of years, waiting to be understood.